Last week, a friend of mine asked me if I could give him some suggestions on buying a brand new CD player, but all of the ones that I suggested were over $400 or more, and that was just out of his budget. So I told him, you should just go to the thrift store and buy a used CD player there and pair it with a great DAC like the new Q-11 from Douk Audio. Now, because he lives out of town, he asked if I could give him some tips on what to look for when thrifting a CD player. So in today's video, I'm going to quickly take you to the thrift store, show you what I look for in a used player to make sure that you don't buy a dud, and then I'll explain why I think this new DAC is almost perfect for the job. Now note that I said almost perfect because there is one thing about it that really drives me nuts. Now, even if you already own a CD player, stick around because I think you'll be interested in learning more about this new DAC that does something that I've never seen before. Now, when you're walking in the thrift store, I completely understand that sense of overwhelm. When you're walking down that aisle and you see all those electronics piled on top of each other. So here are a few tips to make sure that you buy one and you don't get home and you have a dud. Tip number one. It's not likely that you're going to find a dedicated CD player. It's more likely you're going to find an old DVD or Blu-ray player. Those are the ones that everyone's getting rid of right now. And as long as they play CDs, which most do, that will work just fine. And that's where you're going to find the best deal, anywhere from like $5 to even $10. But I want to make sure that you get the right model with the right output to use with a DAC. So be sure to turn the unit around. The first thing I look for is a dedicated digital output, not RCA. So it's usually coaxial or it's an optical output. That's what we're going to use to connect to the DAC. So if you don't see that, just don't buy it. What I do next is I find a power source in the thrift store and I find a CD. There's usually a CD laying around, and I'm going to do a quick test on this player to make sure I don't buy a dud. Now, the first thing I do is power it on. First of all, see if it's going to even power on. And if it does, I want to test the drawer and see if it opens, because if it doesn't open, you're going to have to buy a belt and repair it. And that's just not really cost effective when thrifting a CD player. So as you'll see in this unit here, I could never get the drawer to stay open. It just kept wanting to open and close. So this was a CD player or DVD player that I simply put back and didn't bother buying. Now, the next step is to make sure that it's going to read a disc. So simply, if the drawer does open, pop in that disc that you found in the store and load it into the player. And you're just going to want to see if it will actually read the disc. Usually it will pull up track 1 and you can hit play and you'll see if it can play, and you can skip back and forth between the two. Basically just make sure it's operational. Now you'll see in this player here, I really thought that I was going to buy this one until I tried to load the disc and it said it could not read a disc. So again, I put that one back and didn't buy it. The drawer opening and closing and the disc reading are really the two main things that you want to look for on top of that digital output to make sure you don't come home with a CD player that A, doesn't work, and B, is not compatible. Now here's one more quick hack. If you can't live without a remote control, do a quick search of that item and just see what it would cost to buy a remote, because there's a great chance you're not going to find it there in the thrift store. They just always disappear. Sometimes I have found a cool looking unit only to find out that the remote's going to cost like $30 to $40 for some crazy reason on eBay. Now, a lot of these DVD or Blu-ray players that you find still for a great price in thrift stores, you can get the remotes on Amazon for like $8 to $10. But if a remote is required, just do a quick search to make sure that you're not going to buy a unit where the remote is an astronomical price, but instead that you're going to find one where you can pick up a cheap remote to go with this unit. Okay, so those are my quick tips. Let me show you the unit I have, and then we'll start pairing this with the Q-11 because I'm really excited to tell you about the unique features that come with this new DAC from Douk Audio. Okay, here's the unit that I was able to find and buy. I actually didn't buy this at the store that I was in earlier. I found it at another store. Now, this is just your regular run-of-the-mill Sony Blu-ray player like I was talking about earlier. The model is BDP S570, and it's got that nice film of dust that comes along with anything at the thrift store. Now, this was actually, well, that's upside down. This was actually $17, which you may think is kind of pricey for a thrift store, but it came with the remote still, which never happens. This thing would have cost me $8 to $10 on Amazon, so I figured why not, and went ahead and bought this. Now I'm going to turn this around and we're going to connect it here with the Q-11 to show you how to make that connection. Then I'm going to tell you all the things I like and dislike about this DAC. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm just ignoring these outputs here because that uses the internal DAC on this Blu-ray player, and it's not going to sound near as good as this Q-11. So I am going to bypass the internal DAC by using a coaxial output here. And what I do is I just take a coaxial cable. I've got one here connected there, and that follows over here to the DAC to the same coaxial input here on the DAC. And that's how I'm going to make this connection. I will then take the output, the RCA output on the DAC, and I will connect the other two ends of that to my preamp over here. So this is how you make the connection. Coax from the Blu-ray player to coax input on the DAC, and then RCA output on the DAC to RCA input on the preamp. Hi there, real quick, before I tell you about this DAC, I just want to let you know you now have the option to become a member of my YouTube channel for an extra $2.99 per month. All you have to do is go to my home channel page where you can sign up. You'll see all the added extra features available when you do. Now, this little bit of money each month simply goes to cover the costs that I incur in making these videos weekly. It also allows me to put a little money aside to be able to buy a more expensive piece of gear to review when I'm not able to obtain it directly from a manufacturer. Any added support is always welcome, but never required. Thanks. So what makes a Q-11 such an interesting DAC? Well, unlike all the other DACs I reviewed, this one actually contains two chips inside one box. The AK4493 and the ESS9038Q2M. Now, why is this such a big deal? Well, when you usually buy a DAC, it just comes with one of these chips, either an AKM or an ESS. And there are plenty of debates online as to which sounds better. Well, Douk said, we don't care. You could just have both and choose between the two and try to determine yourself. And I actually think that's kind of a cool feature to have in a DAC, to be able to swap back and forth between the two. So this kind of makes it a great DAC for a beginner who may not know how to decide between an AKM and an ESS. With this $160 DAC, you can now have both options at your fingertips and switch between the two and try to determine if you prefer one sound over the other. Now, outside of offering two DACs inside one, there are a few other features that I really like about this DAC, but there's also one that really drives me nuts. Let's talk about the positives first. You get 3 digital inputs. You get coaxial, optical, and USB. I connected both my Mac and Windows laptops to this DAC, and they were easy to connect without having to download any drivers. Now, on the front of the unit, you'll see a big round knob that can be used for volume. So you can use this as a preamp. And when you short push the knob, it cycles between the inputs that I mentioned earlier. Now, this is where I find one of the features to be just really confusing and disappointing that it was left off by Douk. Now, this unit comes with a remote control. Now, I have no issue with the remote control. It works great. However, the only way to jump back and forth between the AK DAC and the ESS DAC is by using this remote. You can't actually press a button on the front of the unit to make that change. Now, I don't know about you, but every product I've ever owned with a remote has gotten lost. It either falls into the never-ending abyss that is your couch, or maybe your dog eats it, or your kid just throws it in the trash. That means that if you lose this remote with this DAC, then you're kind of stuck on whichever selection you had when you were using the DAC. You can't go up and push a button to change it. And I wish that that was either included in this knob that's already on the front of the unit, or there was just a separate button that would allow you to make that. I think that's an oversight by Douk Audio and really my only issue with this unit. So at this point, you might be wondering, does one of these DAC chips sound better than the other? Well, this is a challenging thing to try to determine. The output voltage as designed is different for each DAC chip, which means that it's really hard to dial in the exact volume for each chip to make sure you're level matching so that you could, in theory, hear whatever the differences could be. Now, I use this in my regular stereo setup and with my headphones, and I couldn't hear that big of a difference between the two to be able to say that one is better than the other. Are there subtle differences? Possibly. They're so small, they're almost even hard to describe here. And that's what makes a DAC with two chips kind of fun and interesting, because now you can buy it and go back and forth between the two. I don't have to tell you which one I think is better. You get the option to decide for yourself. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this DAC is only $160, and I paid, what, $18 for this player, which is still under $200. And it's a lot less than the $400 CD player that I was suggesting to my friend earlier. So there is a considerable discount here if you want to go this route. Now, DACs are flying off the shelves these days. I think a new one arrives here weekly for me to review. If you're interested in learning more about two SMSL DACs that I recently reviewed, you can do so by clicking on this video here.